Today we're studying the fourth Torah portion of the book of Bereshit, Genesis, which is called Vayera. If you happen to be in the blue Art Scroll Chumash, you could find it on page 78. So, this week's Torah portion begins with the story of the three angels. And the opening verse says that God appeared to Abraham in the plain of Mamre, in the plains of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance of the tent in the heat of the day. So our rabbis, starting with Rashi, tell us that why did God appear to Abraham? What's unusual about this is that there's no conversation. It doesn't say God appeared to Abraham and said to him such and such. It just says God appeared to him. Usually if God's going to appear to someone, it's to give him some kind of a message, instruction, but that's not what the verse says. It just says God appeared to him. So rabbis learn from this a very, very important lesson. And the lesson is that the last section of last week's Torah portion discussed the first commandment given to the first Jew, which was the mitzvah of Brit Milah, the mitzvah of circumcision. So Abraham was 99 years old when he circumcised himself in accordance to God's instruction. So you could imagine after a surgery like that, at such an age, Abraham had a difficult, painful recovery. So Vayera elav Hashem, God appears to him. Says Rashi on the very first Rashi of this week's Torah portion, levaker et hachola, to visit the sick. In other words, God performed the mitzvah of bikur cholim, visiting the sick. Now, when you visit somebody, of course, you visit them, you talk to them, but the main idea of visiting the sick is just to show up. You know, they say 80% of life is just showing up. But especially when you're coming to visit the sick, it's not that your words, it's not like when, God forbid, you come to comfort somebody after a loss. Nichum avelim. There, it's the words that you say. Of course, you're showing up means a lot. But here, when you visit the sick, it's just to be with them, to feel their pain, to try to give them encouragement by showing up. And it says that when you visit the sick, you actually take away 1/60th of their illness, our rabbis say. So it's irrelevant what God says to him, because it's not about the conversation. It's that God came to visit him while he was recovering from the surgery of the Brit Milah, the circumcision. Now, why was Abraham sitting at the entrance of the tent in the heat of the day? First question is, why isn't he inside the tent? Why is he by the door, outside the tent, by the entrance? Second question is, why is it important that it was the heat of the day? What difference does it make what the temperature was outside? If it was a sunny day or a cloudy day or a cold day? Main thing is that God came to visit him, to visit the sick. So our rabbis inform us the backstory, which is that after Abraham had his circumcision, God knew that Abraham loves to entertain guests, because Abraham epitomized kindness and generosity. You know, some people, if they have the opportunity or someone asks them to perform an act of kindness, they do it. But other people seek out the opportunities to do good. Abraham, his nature was that he loved to perform acts of kindness. So therefore, he sought out opportunities to do kindness. So therefore, God deliberately made it a brutally hot day so that there should be no travelers on the road during this hot day. So like this, Abraham would not have to be preoccupied with entertaining guests, inviting guests into his home and feeding them. So he could just relax and take it easy and recover from his surgery of circumcision. So that's why it was a very hot day. But what does Abraham do? Abraham is sitting by the door of his tent because he's on the lookout. He wants to make sure he doesn't miss anyone. Maybe there'll be somebody traveling by and he'll be able to invite them into his home and offer them a meal. So God sees that despite the pain that Abraham was in after having underwent a surgery of circumcision, Brit Milah, despite God making it an unusually hot day to deter any travelers from the road so that Abraham could take it easy and not have to entertain guests. Abraham has greater pain from not being able to entertain guests than from the pain of the surgery. And therefore, he's on the lookout by the door of his tent that maybe he could find a guest to invite into his home, which is the setup for the next verse. The next verse says, he lifted his eyes and he saw 3 people coming towards him. And immediately he sees them and he gets up and he runs towards them from the door of his tent and he bows down to them and he says, please, my masters, if I find favor in your eyes, do not pass by my home, my tent, but rather come inside and take a little water and wash your feet and sit under the tree, and I will bring you some bread and you will satiate yourselves with food before you pass on from my home. And they respond and say, we will do as you have requested. So Abraham spots 3 travelers, runs to welcome them into his tent, and offers them some food to eat and some water under the tree. And again, this is Abraham performing the mitzvah of Hachnasat Orchim, welcoming guests into your home. And here our rabbis teach us a fascinating lesson. Our rabbis say, Gedolah Hachnasat Orchim, greater is the mitzvah of performing hospitality, welcoming guests into your home, Mikabalat Pnei Hashchinah. It's even greater to welcome guests into your home than to receive the divine presence. Why? How do we learn that? Where do we see this? Because the opening verses of words of the parsha was that God appeared to Abraham. So God is visiting Abraham, and God is in the presence of Abraham. And then in the corner of his eye, Abraham spots 3 guests. Now I want to ask you a question. Have you ever been at a party and you're talking to somebody, and suddenly you notice someone else at the other side of the room, or somebody walks in that you'll want to talk to, or the person talking to you notices somebody, and they say, I'll be right back, and they run off and they say, I'll be right back, and they run off to talk to that other person. You could consider that a little bit rude. I'm talking to you, and you just leave me standing here to go talk to somebody else? Now consider Abraham. He's talking to God himself. God came to visit him. And what does he do? He says, God, wait here a minute. I got some people I got to take care of. And he runs to welcome the guests. But our rabbis say we learn from this, that if Abraham left God waiting and he went to visit the guests, and welcome them into his home, we see from here that the mitzvah of welcoming guests into your home is even greater than the mitzvah of welcoming the divine presence itself. Today we have a different situation. We have what's known as call waiting. So you're talking on the phone, and suddenly you see another phone call is trying to come in, and you have to decide, who do I want to talk to? Who's more important? And sometimes you say, I'll call you right back, or let me put you on hold. But really, if you think about it, I never really understood it, because of course there's something called an emergency. Sometimes there's an emergency, you have to take the other call. But typically, imagine if you and I are having a conversation, would a third person just come butt into our conversation? I need to talk to you. If someone's talking, you wait till they finish. But with call waiting, people just butt into the conversation, and someone says, what, I'd rather talk to this guy, or this guy's more important, or this matter is more important. But really, people should wait till one conversation is over, and then the next person comes and talks. Just like you wouldn't cut a line in a store, you shouldn't cut a line in a conversation. But especially if the conversation is with God himself, how do you tell God, wait here while I go take care of the guests? And why is it that we derive from this that it's greater to welcome guests than even the divine presence? And I think the answer is very simple. If you're talking to somebody, and this I'm sure has happened to you, your children are playing in the corner of the room, and you notice, or the person you're talking to notices that your kids need something. And the person says, wait here 1 second, and they run to help your children. Your kid needs a glass of water or needs some help with his food or whatever they need. Then you're not offended or disappointed, or you don't consider it rude. You're pleased that this person noticed that your children need something, and he went to help your children. And the same thing with Hashem, and this is such a powerful lesson, that when Hashem sees that we care about each other, God is very pleased to be kept waiting. Abraham says to God, God, you wait here. I need to go welcome those guests, fellow human beings, children of God, in the image of God. I want to honor, respect, and welcome the image of God in my fellow man. God says, nothing is more beautiful, nothing is more pleasing to me than I'll wait here. You go take care of my children, fellow man. And that's what Abraham teaches us until this day. And this is very unique, I believe, to Judaism. In other words, in other religions, the highest encounter you could ever have is with God himself. And of course, there's nothing more sublime than having a conversation with God. We do that through prayer 3 times a day, minimum. Through Torah study, God speaks to us as well. But what Judaism is saying through the first Jew and the story of Abraham leaving God to go welcome the guests is that even greater than encountering God through prayer or through Torah study is encountering God through his image as it's reflected in our fellow man. And this is the lesson of Abraham going to greet these 3 guests, these 3 strangers that are coming down the street, coming down the road, but passing by his tent and offering to host them and provide them with food and drink before they go on their journey. Now, a second lesson our rabbis learned from the story is as follows. What did Abraham say to the guests? He said, take a little water, wash your feet, and sit under the tree, and I'll give you a little bread, and you'll satiate yourself, and then you'll go on with your trip. Then what does he do in verse 6 of chapter 18? He runs, Abraham, to the tent where his wife Sarah was and says, quickly, let us prepare cakes with fine flour. And then he ran to the cattle and he took a calf tender and good and gave it to his youth, to his son, Ishmael, who hurried to prepare the animal. Then he took cream and milk and the calf, which he had prepared, and placed these before them. And he stood over them like a waiter, almost serving them and providing them with their needs as they ate and drank underneath the tree. Now, if you notice, when Abraham welcomed the guests, he said, come and I'll give you some water and some bread. But then after they came and they accepted his invitation, he runs to Sarah and says, let's get fine flour and make cakes. And then he runs and gets a cattle, and he gives the calf tender and good to his son Ishmael to prepare. And then he gets cream and milk and a whole lavish meal. So rabbis say 4 words. We learn from Abraham, emor mi'at v'aseh harbe. Say little and do a lot. There are 2 types of people. There are those who say a lot and do a little. They make big, grandiose promises. They speak a lot, but then they do very little. And then there are people like Abraham, the way we're supposed to be. You say little, I'm going to give you water and bread, but then you overwhelm them instead of underwhelm them by giving them meat and milk and cream and cakes and an elaborate meal. So always deliver more than you promise, rather than the opposite, which is promise more than you deliver. So this is the fascinating opening story on the very first page of the Torah portion of the mitzvah of Hachnasat Orchim, welcoming guests into our home. Now we know that in the finest Jewish tradition, this has always been one of the very important mitzvot in every Jewish community. There are stories about people in the olden days who had 1 bedroom, and the husband and wife would move out of their bedroom to allow the guests to sleep in the bedroom while they would sleep in a side room somewhere on a couch. Obviously, that's an extreme example. But the idea that you welcome guests into your home, whether it's to sleep or to eat, that our tables should not just be filled. Today, many people, their tables are filled with their family, their friends, and that's wonderful to invite family and friends. But Hachnasat Orchim typically means inviting strangers. Someone comes to town, they need a place to eat, they need a place to sleep. And in the olden days, and even today, I should say, this is very much practiced in Jewish communities, where a guest will come to town and people will take them home. In the olden days, but even today as well, in many communities, if someone needs a meal, especially on Shabbat, they'll just go to the local synagogue, and Friday night somebody will go over to them and say, do you have a place to eat? And invite them to come home with them. And that's really the mark of a Jewish table. Maimonides famously says that if the Jewish holidays come, and it's just you and your family and your friends sitting around the table, that is not a celebration of the holiday. It's a celebration of your belly. It's a personal celebration, not a celebration of the holiday and the mitzvah. Because the true joy is when you gladden the hearts, Maimonides says, of those who are less fortunate by bringing poor people to your home, bringing lonely people to your home. And this is the mitzvah that we learn from Abraham, to invite guests into our home. One of the lessons we learn is that Abraham doesn't invite them into his tent. He says, sit under the tree in a nice shady place and I'll give you something to eat. And the question is, why didn't he invite them into the home? Why under the tree? And our rabbis say we learn from this, from Abraham, that we should always think about what's most convenient for our guests. So he saw these guests were on their road. They had a journey to make. They had somewhere to go. They don't have a lot of time to come into his house for an elaborate meal. So he says, you'll sit under the tree. I'll give you something to eat. It'll be quick. Maybe that's why he just said, you'll have some bread and water. You'll be on your way. And then he gave him a little bit more to eat. But the point is that a good host is sensitive to the needs of his guest and tries to do what's in their best interest. It's a great story I once heard about this great rabbi. I forgot his name, and he had a son-in-law, and a man came knocking on the door and needed a place to eat. He said, sure, come on in. I'll give you a place. You're traveling, come on in. It was a cold winter night. And the son-in-law provided him with a delicious meal. He served him. He sat with him just like Abraham. When the man finished his meal, the son-in-law of this rabbi said to the guest, where are you going now? He said, I'm going to go back on the road. He says, but it's late at night. Where are you sleeping? He says, I don't really have a place to sleep. I'm going to continue on my journey through the night. So the son-in-law says, why don't you spend the night here? I'll prepare a bed for you. You'll have a good night's sleep. The guest said, I would love to. So the son-in-law went. He prepared a bed with a towel and blankets. And when the man retired to the bedroom, the son-in-law came back downstairs. He was very pleased with himself. He had really performed the mitzvah of Hachnasat Orchim, welcoming guests in the highest fashion. And the father-in-law saw that he was very pleased with himself. And he said, I want you to know you didn't really do the mitzvah properly. He said, I didn't do the mitzvah properly. How could you say that? I invited this man in. I prepared an entire meal for him. I served him. I ate with him. I sat with him. And then I even said, you need a place to sleep? And I got him a beautiful place, a nice bed, a warm bed to sleep. How could you say that I didn't perform the mitzvah properly? And the father-in-law said, I'll tell you why. Because this guest was enjoying the meal, but during the meal, he was worried about the fact that as soon as the meal is over, he's going to have to get back on the road and continue his journey in a cold night without a place to sleep. So his mind was worried and distracted. What you should have done is, even before you served him the meal, you should have said, do you have a place to eat, to sleep? And when he would have told you no, you would have reassured him right away. Don't worry, after you eat, you can go sleep upstairs. We have a bed for you. And like this, he would have enjoyed the meal so much more. That's what it means, sensitivity to the needs of your guests. Like Abraham, he realized there sometimes a host, could be talking throughout the meal and not letting the guests talk, not drawing the meal out, more time than they want to spend there, and they're at the mercy of the host. So being sensitive to your guests' needs is one aspect of Hachnasat Orchim. But I think the opposite is also true, that as a guest in someone else's home, we always have to be, of course, sensitive to the needs and respectful of the needs of the host. I heard the story about this man who was traveling on a cold winter night. He was really cold and tired, and he saw a house with a light on. So he was so excited he'll have a place to sleep. So he walked towards this house. When he got to the door, he started knocking on the door. He knocked. No one answered. The family was fast asleep, and they didn't hear him. And when he realized he couldn't get in, he's going to have to spend the night outside, he started to sing and dance and sing and dance. And in the morning, when they opened the door, they saw this guy singing and dancing outside. They brought him in. He was so cold. They said, "What happened?" And he said, "I was knocking. You didn't answer. You were sleeping." So he said, "So why were you dancing?" He said, "I was afraid if I would sleep outside in the snow, I would freeze to death. And in the morning, you would wake up, you would see a poor man frozen to death at your door. You would realize that you overslept, you were sleeping while I was knocking on the door. And you would be ridden with guilt for the rest of your life that you caused the death of a poor man. So I danced to stay warm all night so that I should stay alive, because I felt bad that you would find me dead and feel terrible about not having let me in during the night." A very, extreme example, but the idea is that as guests, we're also supposed to think about the needs of our host. So who are these three guests who came to the house of Abraham? So we'll find the very next verse. Verse 9 says, they say to him, meaning the guests say to Abraham, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he says, "Sarah, my wife, is in the tent." And here the guests say, "We will return to you next year at this time, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Now, if these were just ordinary guests, how could they make such a prediction or such a promise? So here our rabbis tell us that these were guests that were sent by God. They were actually angels disguised as human beings. So Abraham could have the satisfaction of taking care of the needs of the guests. And these angels were now relaying a message, a promise, a prediction from God that Abraham and Sarah would be blessed with their first child as a couple, Abraham and Sarah, which of course would be Isaac, who would be the father of the Jewish nation. Now, before we get into the whole promise of having a child, which was Isaac, the first Jewish child born to the first Jewish couple, we have something quite phenomenal here. And that is that now that we understand these were angels, angels don't need to eat. They don't need food. They don't need drink. So it means that Abraham's mitzvah of serving the guests, in reality, these were guests that had no benefit from the food or drink because they were really angels. So why is it that this mitzvah of Hachnasat Orchim, of inviting guests into your home, is derived and learned from the story of Abraham, a story where in actuality there was no Hachnasat Orchim, there was no hospitality for the guests, because the guests didn't eat, they really didn't drink, they didn't need the food or the drink. And here rabbis tell us another amazing lesson, a beautiful, beautiful teaching of the Talmud. The Talmud says, "Yoter mima shabal habayit oseh im ha'ani," more than the master of the house does for the poor man, ha'ani oseh im ha'bal habayit, the poor man does for the master of the house. When you invite a poor man into your house and you give them food and drink, you as the master of the house feel that you're the giver and they're the taker, they're the receiver, they're the recipient. Comes the Talmud and turns it around and says, no, it's the other way around. More than the master of the house is giving the poor man is actually giving the master of the house. Why is that? Because the master of the house is giving food and drink, something physical, sustenance, to the poor man. The poor man is giving the rich man, the master of the house, the opportunity to be a giver. And there's no comparison between giving something physical and material compared to something that is spiritual, like the opportunity to express your goodness by being a giver to others. And that's why specifically the lesson is derived from the story of Abraham with the angels, because in this case, it's quite evident that the givers were the guests. The angels were giving Abraham the opportunity to give, because Abraham in actuality wasn't giving anything at all. And here we learn, again, a fascinating lesson that when we have poor people, and it doesn't matter if it's a poor person who comes to your home to eat, or a poor person who comes to your office for a donation or a check, or a poor man that you see on the street that you give a few dollars on the corner at the red light, we often think we're the givers, but they're actually the ones who are giving us the opportunity to be able to give. And Rav Shlomo Carlebach once said, he said, whenever he would talk about poor people, if he told a story about a beggar, he would always say the holy beggar. And someone said to him, why do you call the beggars holy beggars? What's so holy about a beggar? So he said that in heaven, God determined that the world has to have kindness. If everyone had what they needed, there would be no opportunity to give. And we would never have the pleasure and the meaning of giving. So God made imbalances in the world. Some people have more, some people have less. And it's not only in money, it's in every area of life. It's in health, sometimes it's in wisdom, or whatever area of life that one has more than the other and can give to the other. So he says, God says in heaven, okay, in order for the world to have chesed, kindness, there has to be givers and takers. There has to be rich and poor. Who wants to be rich? Everyone raised their hand. I'll be the giver. I'll be the rich one. He said, who's willing to take on the role of being the poor person? And this beggar said, I'll play the role of the poor man in this world so that others can have the opportunity to give and do chesed, do kindness. So Rav Shlomo Carlebach said, is he not a holy beggar? Is he not a holy beggar? And I just heard a story recently about there was a rich man, and this poor man would often come to him for tzedakah. And one day, it was a snowy day, and the streets were filled with snow, but people were walking on the snow, so the snow was all dirty, muddy, black, especially in the old days. They didn't have paved roads. So when the poor man came, he didn't want to come through the front door of the house because he knew he would make all the rugs and the house dirty. So he went around to the back of the house and he knocked on the door to get a little charity or get some food and come in. And the rich man said, why are you at the back door? Why didn't you come to the front door? He said, I didn't want to come with my dirty, muddy boots through your house. I came to the rear entrance. He said, please go around and come through the front door. He said, okay. He went around to the front door. He opened it up. He welcomed him in like an honored guest. And later, the poor man said to the rich man, I try to come through the back door, not to have to walk through your house with my dirty boots. Why did you insist I come through the front door? And the rich man said, I don't want my children to ever think that my carpets or my rugs or my furniture is more important than the honor and the dignity of a human being. I don't want my children to think that a poor man's self-esteem isn't as important or more important than my physical belongings. For you to have to come through the back door as a pauper is not appropriate. I wanted you deliberately to come through the front door so my children should see how I perform the mitzvah of hachnasat orchim, welcoming guests into our home. Now, we then come to the promise of the angels. The angels say, you're going to have a child in 1 year's time. And Sarah overhears this in the tent. And the Torah then goes to say, Abraham and Sarah were quite elderly, advanced in their years. And Sarah had ceased to have the menstrual cycle of women. And what does Sarah do when she hears the news? Vatitzchak Sarah b'kirba limor. Sarah laughs within herself. She laughs internally. And she says to herself, after my skin has already withered, shall I still once again have delicate skin? And in addition, my husband is old. Now, Sarah was 90 and her husband, Abraham, was 99. So Sarah laughs at this suggestion that at this stage, she's going to have a child after her skin is already withered, which means she no longer can have a menstrual cycle. She can no longer produce milk to nurse a baby, and so on and so forth. The very next verse says, God says to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, can I have a child when I am so old already? Is there anything beyond God? I reiterate, God says, next year, this time, she will be holding a baby boy. She will have a son. And the next verse says, when Abraham says to Sarah, why did you laugh? Sarah denies it and says, I did not laugh. Why? Because she was afraid to admit that she actually laughed at the promise of God that she would have a child. And Abraham says, no, you did indeed laugh. Now, there's so many questions on this story. The first question our rabbis ask, and the rabbis in the Talmud discuss all these questions. The first question is, Sarah laughs. And the question is, where was Sarah's faith? God says you're going to have a child and you don't believe it. The second question is, if you remember last week, when God told Abraham that he would have a child, Abraham also laughed. Yet, God doesn't seem to reprimand Abraham for laughing. Now, it's just good to know that this son is later called Yitzchak because of the word tzchok, because his parents laughed at the promise and the suggestion that they would have a child in their elderly age. The third question is, Sarah said, my skin has withered and my husband is old. But when God confronts Abram and says, why did Sarah laugh? God doesn't say that she said, you are too old, Abraham. God says to Abraham, she said, she is too old. The fourth question is, why is God going to Abraham? Let's say you have a problem with something that someone's wife did. You should go confront the wife. It wouldn't be right to go to the husband and say, you know what your wife did? She did this and this. Why did she do that? That's only going to create strife and ill will in the marriage. So why is God going to Abraham to say, why did Sarah laugh? Why don't you go directly to Sarah? Now, the next question is, when confronted, Sarah lies about it and says, no, I didn't laugh. How could she deny the fact that she laughed? We just read that she did laugh. Is she lying about what she did? So one of the approaches, and this is a very novel interpretation, by the way, it's not the literal interpretation, is that God was not reprimanding Sarah for laughing, just like God didn't reprimand Abraham for laughing, because it's quite unbelievable that at the age of 99 and 90, you are going to have a child. You know, laughter is usually the result of something that's unexpected. What's a punchline? A punchline is a story is going in a certain direction, and suddenly it goes in a different direction that you were not expecting it to go in, and you start laughing because you didn't expect that. So the idea of an old couple having a baby would invoke laughter. So Abraham laughs when he hears the news. And God doesn't reprimand him in last week's Torah portion for his lack of faith, because it doesn't even imply lack of faith. It's just like, that's funny. The thought that we're going to have a baby is a funny thought. It's like if you see a little kid, you ever see a little kid dressed like an old man? It's funny. Why? Because he's a little kid and he's dressed like an old man. So the idea of an old couple having a baby is a funny thought. So, okay, Abraham laughed. The question is, why did God reprimand Sarah then for laughing? And why does God talk to Abraham about what Sarah did? A very novel interpretation I once heard is as follows. Abraham was told in last week's Torah portion by God he's going to have a baby with his wife Sarah. Now, from the fact that when Sarah hears the news from the angels in this week's Torah portion, she laughs. When I tell a joke, you laugh. But if you heard the joke already, you don't laugh. Unless you're just being polite. You don't want to insult me that you heard it, so you pretend like you're laughing. But real laughter is only when it's the first time you heard it, then you didn't expect the outcome. But once you've heard it, you don't laugh because you already know what's coming. When you know what's coming, you don't laugh. It's funny. If someone tickles you, you start laughing. But if you tickle yourself, you don't laugh because you know it's coming. You expect it. Now, the fact that Sarah laughs means that it's the first time she ever heard this news, which means that when Abraham heard it last week in the Parsha, he didn't come home and tell his wife Sarah. Because had he told his wife Sarah, she would have laughed then, and she would have laughed today when God, through the angel, tells her she's going to have a baby. So the question then becomes, why didn't Abraham come home and tell his wife, honey, I got great news. God told me today we're going to have a child. Obviously, not only did he laugh, but he didn't either believe it fully himself, or he was afraid to tell his wife to get her hopes up, and then she'll be disappointed if it doesn't come to pass. So now God is really not reprimanding Sarah, he's reprimanding Abraham. He's saying, Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? That implies you never told her the news I shared with you last week. Why didn't you have enough faith in my promise that you would not be afraid to share the news with her because you would have confidence that it's going to come to pass? Obviously, you hesitated because you were not so trusting of my promise. That's just a very unique way to look at the story. But the little story is she laughs because she doesn't have enough faith that it could happen. And when Abraham says to her, why did you laugh? It says, Vatichache Sarah. Sarah denies it. So it's very interesting because it doesn't say she said or she, lied, God forbid. It says she denied it. So we all know what denial is. Sometimes people are in denial. When someone's in denial, they're not lying. It's just that their brain is not allowing them to accept it. So they are not processing it, and therefore they're in denial. Why would someone be in denial? Because they're afraid to face that reality. And that's what happened. When Sarah was confronted by the fact that she laughed, she denied it. Why? Because Kiareya, she was afraid to admit to herself even that she would laugh on the promise of God. What does Abraham do? Which is a good instructive lesson for us. If you're dealing with someone who's in denial, like Abraham was dealing with his wife, do you allow them to continue to be in denial, or do you force them to see the reality? What does Abraham do? Abraham says to his wife, no, you did laugh. Face the facts. Don't live in denial. Admit the truth. And many times people in our lives are in denial of one thing or another. Someone has a drug problem or alcohol problem or some other problem, and we try to tell them and they deny it because they can't accept the consequences of admitting that it's true. And what do you need to do? If you love the person, you need to be honest with them. And sometimes you have to stage an intervention to make them confront the truth and the reality. Because if a person's living in denial, they'll never change. They'll never get help. So letting them live in denial is not helping them. Sometimes we are forced to make them realize the truth, even if it's painful for them to accept it in the short term. In the long term, it will be to their benefit. Now, if all of this was not enough excitement for one Torah portion, Abraham inviting the guests, the promise of the birth of the first child, and just realize that, someone once said, this kid once asked his father, Dad, do we Jews believe in miracles? And his father said, no, sonny boy, we do not believe in miracles. We rely on miracles. We know that the existence of the Jewish people has been a miraculous existence, so much so that there's no rational way to explain how a population of less than 1% of the world's population, 0.2%, outlived. First of all, forget about outlived, just survived. Usually when you're 1/5 of 1%, usually gets swallowed up in the 99.8% of the rest of the world's population. So even the fact that we maintained our identity, our heritage, our beliefs, our values as Jews distinct is miraculous in and of itself. Now consider that in every generation, mighty regimes try to annihilate us, and yet we're here and all these powerful countries and empires are gone. Surely it's supernatural, it's miraculous. It's because of God's promise to Abraham, your children will be an eternal people like the stars in the heaven. So our entire existence has been miraculous, but it actually began with a miracle, a baby boy being born to a couple 99 and 90 years old. So our very inception, our very birth, our very creation began with a miracle, and it has been miraculous ever since. So now we come to the next major story in not only this week's Torah portion, but I would say major story in the whole Bible, a story that everyone knows, and a story that people often till today use as a reference. When you want to talk about a very wicked society, you say it's like Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah epitomizes wickedness and evil. Why? Because in this week's Torah portion, God tells Abraham, listen, I'm about to go and destroy the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because the cry of the poor people from this city has reached heaven. Now, why does the story of Sodom and Gomorrah come right after the story of Abraham? There's a story told about an artist who once wanted to paint a portrait of the most beautiful person. So he went and found the most handsome, beautiful person, and he asked him, could you sit in my studio? I want to paint a portrait of you. The man sat through the portrait and he painted this beautiful portrait. Years later, the painter, the artist said, I want to paint the ugliest person. So he went down to the Bowery where all the poor drunks were laying there. He took this dirty, disheveled guy. He said, do me a favor, come sit in my studio. I want to paint a portrait of you. And he painted a portrait. And afterwards he says, go upstairs. I prepared, a room for you. I want you to take a shower, get clean. I'll send in a barber to give you a haircut and clean you up and make you look nice. He'll get a tailor, get you nice clothing and a manicure and everything you need. And you'll come down and join me for dinner. That's what this fellow did. When he came down to the dinner table, all groomed and clean and neat and beautiful, he realized, the artist, that it was the same person he had painted a number of years ago, the most beautiful person. We all can be the most beautiful version or the ugliest version of ourselves. And as a human race, we know this to be true. Human beings could be like angels, most beautiful, sublime, selfless, generous human beings, or God forbid, like the worst of humanity, evil, cruel, heartless, merciless, and corrupt. So the story of Sodom and Gomorrah comes right after the story of Abraham and the angels. Why? Because the Torah wants to show us the contrast. You know why the people of Sodom and Gomorrah deserve to be destroyed by God? Not only because they were wicked, obviously, but because they had free choice. They could have been like Abraham. When you know what someone is capable of being, then you understand how depraved their situation is. When you realize that every human being has free choice, you could be like Abraham. On the third day of his circumcision, when he's in the greatest pain, he's sitting by the door of his tent looking for opportunities to help people, to be kind. And then when you turn the next page to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, who outlawed kindness. It was forbidden. The laws in Sodom and Gomorrah said you cannot invite guests into your home. The opposite of Abraham. Why? Because, like they say, like if you feed a cat, the cat will come back again and again. In Sodom and Gomorrah, they said, we don't want homeless people here. We don't want poor people coming through our town, knocking on our doors. So they made a law. No one's allowed to give money to the poor or give hospitality or a place to eat or sleep, because then more poor people are going to come to our town. And Rashi says, what was the cry that reached God? There was a girl who took pity on a poor man and gave him something to eat, and they put this girl to death. And this girl's cries reached the heavens. So because we are capable of being the most beautiful, sublime reflection of divinity, by being in the image of God, by being kind and compassionate and loving and caring of one another, therefore the selfish, evil deeds of Sodom and Gomorrah reached the heavens, and God said I need to destroy these cities. But God notifies Abraham of what he's going to do. And here we see the righteousness of Abraham. Instead of Abraham, who was a righteous man, sometimes when people are righteous, they become what they call self-righteous. Self-righteous is, I'm the only one who's righteous. No one else is as righteous as me. And therefore, if you want to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, you might have expected Abraham to say, absolutely, get rid of these wicked people. but not Abraham. Abraham is righteous, but not self-righteous. He wants everyone to be righteous. And he sees the potential in everyone to be righteous. And he immediately begins to pray and plead with God to spare the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And his argument to God is, you are the judge of the world. Will you not do justice? How could you destroy the city? There are some righteous people living in the city. Can you punish the righteous together with the wicked? And God says, I'll tell you what, find me 50 righteous people in the entire city, and I will spare the whole city. Abraham looks around, he doesn't see 50 people. So he says, God, what if it's missing 5 people? Will you go ahead with your plans just because we couldn't find 5 righteous people? What's if there are 45 righteous people? And God says, you know what? Deal. You find 45 righteous people, I will not destroy. But once again, Abraham can't find 45. So Abraham says, what's if I find 40? God says, no problem. You find 40 righteous people, I will spare the city for the 40 righteous. And well, you know what happens. Abraham says, how about 30? How about 20? How about 10? And God says, you know what? Find me a minion. 10 righteous people, I'll spare the city. But of course, Abraham could not find even 10 righteous people. At that point, Abraham backs off. He relents. He returns to his place. He realizes he cannot persuade God because he couldn't even find 10 righteous people. And here we see the idea of a quorum, a minion of people that are good, could spare an entire city. I once heard an interpretation, I'm not sure from who, maybe the Kotzker Rebbe, who said, there's one more thing Abraham could have and should have done. He should have said, I'll move into the city. And if he would have moved in, maybe he could have transformed the entire city. But the Kotzker Rebbe did say that whenever Abraham negotiates with God, he says, what's if we find X amount? He started with 50, then 45, then 40, in the midst of the city. Meaning to say that not only are these righteous people on the outskirts of the city, sitting alone in isolation, detached from the community, but if they're in the midst of the city, if they're engaged in the affairs of the community, they're working on behalf of the community, then they could help save this city. So God goes ahead with his plan to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. But of course, I'm just going to try to pick up a little bit of speed because there's so much more going on. He's going to save Lot, the nephew of Abraham, and a lot going on in this week's Torah portion, but basically Lot cannot convince his son-in-laws to leave the town with him. The angels go to Sodom to notify Lot to come with them to be rescued. The son-in-laws do not believe that it's going to happen. They choose to stay behind. Lot ends up running away with his wife and daughters. Sadly, there's a terrible aftermath to the story, and that is they run to the hills, they hide in a cave, the city goes up in flames, and unfortunately, his daughters say, you know, they didn't know that only their city was destroyed. They thought the whole world was destroyed. They thought there were no more human beings besides them. They said, how's the world going to continue? So they get their father drunk, and they sleep with their father and procreate with him in order to preserve the future of mankind. And both daughters do this and father 2 sons who become the fathers of 2 nations, Moab and Ami, which means from my father, from my nation. And again, unfortunate aftermath to the story of Lot's being rescued. But the daughters did have good intentions, thinking that the world's population would end if they do not cohabitate with their father. Now, after that, there's another major story in this week's Torah portion, chapter 20, where Abraham's wife Sarah is abducted for the second time. If you remember, last week she was abducted by Pharaoh. She was a beautiful woman. Now she's abducted by Avimelech. And once again, God intervenes so that she should be returned to her husband. But the real excitement of the Torah portion begins with chapter 21, when finally, Isaac is born as the angels had promised to Sarah, and they named this child Isaac at his circumcision at the age of 8 days. And of course, in Judaism, circumcision is done in 8 days. Sometimes you hear about Jewish couples who have a baby and they circumcise the baby in the hospital. And I just want to point out that the word circumcision is not the word Brit. Brit, Milah, means the covenant of circumcision, which means that circumcision is an operation. Many non-Jews have circumcisions. The majority of non-Jews have circumcisions. A Jewish Brit Milah is a covenant with God. It's entering the child into a covenant with God. So it's like the difference of getting your marriage license at the courthouse or having a wedding ceremony with a rabbi who sanctifies the marriage. One is just a ritual. Well, one is just a legalistic thing. Circumcision is just a physical surgery. It doesn't have spirituality. It doesn't have meaning to it. Brit Milah is the covenant of Abraham. But in addition to that, it's supposed to be at 8 days old. If you do it in the hospital, besides that, there's no family gathered. Even the parents often are not there during the circumcision in the hospital. The doctors just take care of it, so to speak. There's no Jewish name given. But also, it's usually done in the hospital on day 1 or day 2. And we know that the Torah says it should be on day 8. And medically, it's been proven that that's the best time because of the blood coagulation. Vitamin K is at the highest peak at that point. And therefore, it's the perfect time to have the circumcision. And a big celebration for the birth and the circumcision of Abraham. There's story after story after story. Time is running out, so I'm just going to tell you 2 more major stories. One is the story of Ishmael having a bad influence on his younger brother Isaac, Sarah asking Abraham to drive away the mother Hagar and the son. Abraham is very torn. He loves his son Ishmael, but she persuades him, and he asks God what to do. And God says, whatever your wife Sarah tells you, listen to her voice, because through Isaac will be your progeny, the Jewish nation. He will become a great nation too, which is the Arab nations, but your son Isaac will be the Jewish people. And we know what happens. Hagar goes out. We read about this actually on Rosh Hashanah with Ishmael out in the desert. Abraham sends her with a flask of water, but the water runs out, and Hagar cannot see the way her son is dying of thirst. She goes away from a distance not to have to observe it, but an angel comes and says, open your eyes. God made a well and saves the life of Ishmael. Again, a lot of commentary, but we can't get into all of it. But here is the grand finale of this week's Torah portion. And this is, again, not just the highlight of this week's Torah portion, but one of the most talked about stories in the entire Bible. And that is the closing story of this week's Torah portion, Vayera, chapter 22, famous story of the binding of Isaac. God tests Abraham by saying, I want you to take your only son that I just gave you, the one you love, the one that I promised you will have a great nation out of, and bring him up as an offering at Mount Moriah, Har HaMoriah. And Abram gets up early in the morning. He saddles his donkey. He goes out on the journey to do as God had told him. And we all know the story. He binds him up, lifts up his knife, and as he's about to slaughter his son, an angel says, no, Abraham, don't harm, don't touch the lad. It was all a test to see how deep your faith in God is, how far you would go for God. And now God sees that unequivocally he has tested you, and you have proven your mettle, that you are completely devoted to God. There's nothing that comes before your devotion to God, even the love of your son. And now I promise you, your children will be like the stars in the heaven and the sand on the seashore. And as they say, the rest is history. Now, this story is a very difficult, controversial story. What does this mean? Was Abraham ready to kill his son? He prays for Sodom and Gomorrah, but he doesn't plead for his own son. And obviously, in the few minutes we have left, we can't really get into it in too much depth. Obviously, there have been books written about this story, not just commentary. However, the test was enormous, because not only was it a physical sacrifice, Abraham lived in a time where the pagan practices were that people sacrificed their children to their gods. And Abraham was the one who went about preaching and teaching others that you should never kill another human life, take away a life, especially your own children, for the name of your religion or your God. But unfortunately, now he's being asked to do that by God. And he had to go contrary not only to his feelings of love for his child, but he had to be willing to surrender his future as a Jewish nation and seem like a hypocrite by contradicting his own beliefs and going against what he believed. Now, we know that many people sacrifice their lives for their values and their ideals. Every soldier who goes to war for his country is willing to sacrifice, and many sadly sacrifice their lives for what they believe in. But at least, as great as that is, and that is really the ultimate sacrifice, the comfort of knowing that I am dying, but I'm dying for a purpose that I believe in, is at least the saving grace in the sacrifice. Abraham was willing to do it, not just for himself, but for his child, which is even more difficult than yourself, and for something he does not believe in. Why? Because God told him to do it. That's the ultimate surrender to God. And of course, it's through the story that God conveys the message for all future generations that we should never take another life in the name of God. And we all saw what happened yesterday in Vienna, Austria, with the Islamic fundamentalists who killed 2 people in multiple attacks throughout the city, one near the synagogue, actually, and dozens of people were injured. And Judaism stands as a protest. This story stands as a protest against any religion, because the attackers called out Allah Akbar, as they always do, as they did on 9/11, praising God as they do this, believing that this is what God wants them to do. And Judaism, through the story of the binding of Isaac, and God saying, do not take the lad, do not harm the lad, do not lay a hand on him. This was only a test, but never would God ever ask of anyone to harm another human being in his name. And therefore, this remains the lesson of this story, that in the name of religion, in the name of God, we should never, ever harm or hurt, or God forbid, ever murder another human being. With this, we conclude the Torah portion. As you can see, there's a lot to delve into. So hopefully everyone will continue to study it, and will continue to come to shul maybe on Shabbos if you can, and continue to study this Torah portion, because there are such fundamental stories in this week's Torah portion. If anyone has any questions, you could type it in, so we can answer any questions that anyone may have. And if not, wish everyone a beautiful day ahead and week ahead, and everyone should be well. And whatever the results are tonight, everyone should just have trust in Hashem and remain united as a country. And let us pray that everything should go well, and we should only have peace and unity and calm in our country, and we should go forth with faith and trust in God. Wishing everyone a beautiful day, and thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you all soon. Take care.